Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Jason Freeman. I work here in the Author Events Office, and I'm privileged to be here tonight to introduce Tom Perrotta. Variously dubbed the Steinbeck of suburbia, the Balzac of the burbs, and an American Chekhov, Tom Perrotta was hailed by the Washington Post as a daring chronicler of our most profound anxieties and human desires. He is the author of some of the most popular and critically acclaimed novels of our time, including Election, which was adapted into an Oscar-nominated film starring Matthew Broderick and Reese Witherspoon, Little Children, which was adapted into a film for which he won an Academy Award nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay, and my one true love, The Leftovers, named to several prominent Best of the Year lists and adapted by HBO into a popular TV series for which he wrote several episodes and served as executive producer. He's also the author of a plethora of short stories and essays, and other of his assorted work has been featured on scores of Best of the Year lists. On to tonight's book. Mrs. Fletcher is Mr. Perrotta's seventh novel and his first since The Leftovers. It tells the story of Eve, an empty nester whose placid life is upended by an anonymous, salacious text message, a message I'm sure you're all very intrigued to hear more about. It's also about her son, Brendan, a college freshman whose privilege and frat boy notions of sex and relationships are quickly upended by his new environment. The New York Times says that Perrotta steers through this miry slough with skill, sensitivity, and good-natured confidence, and that, in the end, these characters and all of us are given a glimpse of something both titillating and terrifying, as if we all awake at the end from the madness and tumult of a mid-semester night's dream. Here to tell us more, ladies and gentlemen, Tom Perrotta.
No, thanks everybody. It's so nice to be here. I grew up in New Jersey, not too far away, so I used to come on class trips and also to see concerts occasionally. Also weddings where there was no food, only alcohol. All right. So as he mentioned, Mrs. Fletcher is about Eve, who is really the main character, but it tracks Eve and her son Brendan, and I want to read you a section from Brendan's first semester in college. He is a kind of an oafish frat boy, and he tells his story in very blunt terms. So in the it's sort of the activities fair at the beginning of the semester, he meets a young woman who runs a sort of a group for students who have autistic siblings, and Brendan decides to attend the meeting, and this is, I'll read part of this chapter. It's called Parents' Weekend. We were about an hour into the meeting at that point, and already I was itching for it to be over. There are only so many stories you can listen to about somebody's autistic brother or sister. I was only there for Amber, who I hadn't seen since the night we protested in the library. I'd texted her a bunch of times, trying to get her to meet me for coffee or pizza or whatever, but she kept putting me off, saying that she'd see me at the October meeting of the Autism Awareness Network, and we could make a plan then. She was so insistent about the meeting that I started to wonder if she saw me more as a new recruit than a guy she might want to hook up with. But I liked her enough that it was worth a couple hours of my time to figure out which it was. So far, things were looking pretty good on the hookup side of the equation. She'd let out a happy little squeal when I walked through the door, and then led me around the room, introducing me to her friends like I was some kind of VIP. This is Brendan, she told the vice president. He's the first year I was telling you about. Brendan, this is Kat. Hey, Brendan. Kat looked me up and down like she was thinking about buying me. Amber was hoping you'd come. Shut up, Amber told her, her cheeks a shade pinker than normal. Instead of her usual sweats and hoodie, she was wearing skinny jeans and a tight top and sexy platform sandals, the kind of clothes you'd wear to a party or a date. She had nice small boobs. I hadn't really gotten a good look at them before. They went really well with her athletic build. All I meant is that we need more men in the group, Kat said with a smirk, reaching into her purse for the Purell. Kat is always disinfecting her hands. I wasn't trying to insinuate anything. It's true. Amber glanced at the Asian hipster who was standing in a circle of girls, basking in the attention. Usually it's just Quan. I'm sure he'll be happy to have a bro. I don't know, I said, because Quan was giving me the stink eye, like I'd crashed his party. Looks like he's doing fine without me. Kat headed over to the refreshment table, leaving me alone with Amber. I'm so glad you came, she said, placing her hand on my forearm, super casual, like she didn't even know she was doing it. But I knew. I felt it way down in my balls, a warm surge of power, like someone had just turned the key and started the engine. After the break, a girl named Nellie told us about her brother, who was really smart, but flapped his hands and grunted a lot, which made it hard to take him anywhere. 3 girls in a row said they had siblings with Asperger's. This other girl, Dora, said she was the only normal kid out of 4 siblings. The other 3 were all diagnosed PDD-NOS, and one of them was totally nonverbal. Amber suggested that Dora stop using the word normal and substitute neurotypical instead. It's less hurtful that way, she explained. And besides, in your family, it actually seems like autism is the norm, right? Dora shrugged. My mom always calls me her normal one. That's how she introduces me to strangers. This is Dora. She's my normal one. The hipster Quan had a brother named Zhang who acted out too much to go to regular school. He was totally hyper and would run around in circles whenever he got worked up. The only thing that calmed him down was playing the piano. When he was 7 years old, he sat down and played The Entertainer from that old movie, The Sting. It came out of nowhere. No one in the family had seen the movie, and Quan's parents were first-generation immigrants who only listened to classical music. But Zhang totally nailed it. My parents were so happy that day, Quan said. It was like, oh my God, our son's a genius. They were really proud of Zhang, which was amazing to see, because they were usually pretty ashamed of his condition and didn't know how to help him. They hired a piano teacher who specialized in kids with special needs and did everything they could to encourage his gift. Quan stopped talking and looked around in case anyone had questions. He was wearing cuff jeans, a tight plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his biceps, and a beige fedora, but I liked him anyway. That's so cool, Kat said. Does he play classical or jazz? Quan shrugged. He plays The Entertainer. Over and over and over. Every fucking day of his life. Every time I call home, I hear him in the background banging it out. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I can't tell you how much I hate that song. But you love your brother, right? Said Amber. I do, said Quan. But I was happy to get to college. My little stepbrother was autistic. My little half-brother was autistic, but I hadn't grown up with him. I was already in high school when he was born, and I wasn't getting along with my father at the time, or with my stepmother, Bethany, who I like to think of as the evil bitch who ruined my life. I realize now that it was stupid to blame her for the divorce. It wasn't like she brainwashed my dad and kidnapped him from my mom and me. Whatever my dad did, he did because he chose to do it, because he wanted to. I still remember the day he explained that to me. He took me out for ice cream, put his arm around my shoulder, and said, look, Brandon, if you have to hate somebody for what happened, hate me, okay? Don't take it out on Bethany. She's an innocent bystander, just like you. The custody agreement said he'd get me 2 weekends a month, but he didn't complain if I blew him off for a sleepover at a friend's house, or even if I just needed to stay home and catch up on my schoolwork. I was playing 3 sports at the time, so mostly he just came to my weekend games and took me out to dinner afterward. That was pretty much our relationship right after the divorce. My dad and me at Wild Willie's or Haddington Burrito Works, talking about whatever game I just played, acting like everything was perfectly normal, like this was how it was supposed to be. I saw him even less right after John was born. There wasn't one specific day when he sat me down and said, "There's something seriously wrong with your brother." It was more like a steady drip of bad news. They didn't know why he wasn't talking, why he ignored his toys, why he wouldn't look his father in the eye or smile at his mother. The doctors had concerns about the severity of his tantrums. By the time they were openly using the word autistic, I was getting along better with my dad, and even with Bethany, who had turned out to be a nicer person than I'd given her credit for. She was a lot younger than my mom, and had been pretty hot when my dad married her, but she'd aged a lot in the past few years. You could see it in her eyes how hard it was, having a kid like John, and you couldn't help but feel a little sorry for her. There was a brief period during my junior year when we tried to be a 2-weekend-a-month family. I'd pack my bag, and my dad would pick me up on the way home from work and bring me to his new house. The only problem was John freaked out whenever I showed up. He didn't just get upset. He totally fucking lost it. Bethany would be all fake cheerful when I got there, like, "Hey, John, look who's here. It's your big brother. Can you say hi to Brendan?" John wouldn't even look at me. He just waved his arms around and screamed like I was a monster who was coming to eat him. Sometimes he'd throw himself on the ground and start punching himself in the head, which was a terrible thing to see because he wasn't fooling around. Once he got going on a meltdown like that, he could keep it up for hours. When he finally wore himself out and fell asleep, the rest of us would have a little time to hang out in peace. But it wasn't really peace, because we were all so rattled by what had just happened. We'd play a game or two of Yahtzee, and then Bethany would head up to bed, and my dad and I would watch an episode of Scrubs, which we both loved. Those were some of the best father-son times I can remember. The two of us sitting on the couch, cracking up about something completely ridiculous J.D. said to Turk. It felt really good just being in the same place, enjoying the same thing. When the show was over, he'd kiss me goodnight, something he never used to do before the divorce, and we'd both go to bed. Then I'd wake up the next morning, head downstairs for breakfast, and John would start screaming all over again. It was hard on everybody, so we eventually gave up and went back to the old way, me and my dad getting together for the occasional dinner, talking about sports and TV shows and college and girls. He was easy to talk to, a lot easier than my mom, though that was probably just because he was a guy and because he never gave me the feeling that he was judging me or wishing I was a different person than I actually am. I always made sure to ask him about John, and he always said something positive like, "He's getting big," or "He really likes his new teacher," but I never pressed for details. John's life was a mystery to me. I had no idea what he did all day, what he thought about, or why he hated me so much. Mostly I just lived my life without thinking about him at all. I wasn't planning on going into my whole family history at the meeting. To be honest, I wasn't planning on talking at all, but Amber just sort of coaxed it out of me. After a while, I forgot about the other people in the room. It was just me talking and Amber listening. I told her how my father had invited himself to Parents' Weekend, catching me totally off guard. I thought that was a great idea. I hadn't seen him since the week before I left for school, but said he'd have to work it out with my mom, because she was planning on coming, and they didn't usually do stuff like that together. "I'll talk to the boss," he said. I still have no idea how he managed it, but he called a week later and said he'd gotten a thumbs up. The plan was for my dad to come on his own, because it didn't make sense to take a kid like John to an event like Parents' Weekend. He hated long car rides, responded badly to new environments, and was often freaked out by unfamiliar faces. It would be easier for everybody if he stayed home with his mom and followed the usual routine. Easier for everybody except Bethany, I guess. It'll just be us guys, my dad said. Maybe we can go to the football game. If Zach wants to join us, he's more than welcome. Zach was totally up for that. He and my dad had talked on the phone a few times, and Zach told everybody what a chill guy he was, way chiller than his own parents, who, he was happy to report, were staying home in Boxborough for the weekend. His little sister was competing in an Irish step dance competition, and that was a big deal in his house. You ever see that shit, bro? It's like these girls are all dancing with a stick up their ass and smiling like it's the best feeling in the world. We had the whole day planned. Football game in the afternoon, barbecue on the quad for dinner, and then this student talent show that people raved about. Who knows, Zach said. Maybe your dad'll get drunk with us. Yeah, right. I'm serious, bro. You think he still smokes weed? Dude, he's not going to smoke weed with us. Trust me. We should take him to a party, Zach said. Maybe we could get him laid. Don't even go there, I said. For the whole week leading up to Parents' Weekend, that was the big joke in our room. All the wild shit we were going to do with my dad. I knew none of it would happen, but it was fun to think about and put us both in this goofy, stoked-up mood, like something big was about to happen. And then, the day before Parents' Weekend, I got the phone call. Change of plans, he said. I'm really sorry. You're not coming? No, I'm still coming, but I'm bringing the gang. The gang? Bethany and John. Oh. What was I supposed to say? You couldn't tell your dad not to bring his wife and kid. All right, sure. You okay with that? I guess. I only have 3 tickets for the football game, and one of them's for Zach. Yeah, he said. I'm not so sure about the football game. Think I can get a rain check? They showed up around 11 on Saturday morning. I hadn't seen John in about 6 months, and I almost didn't recognize him. He was a lot bigger than I remembered. He was really cute, blonde hair and blue eyes, and those long eyelashes that everybody who met him commented on. Bethany had dressed him in khakis and a button-down shirt and a little denim jacket. He looked like a model in a Gap Kids catalog, but that wasn't the main thing. He just seemed more together than the kid I remembered. He was actually looking in my general direction and not screaming his head off. Look, Bethany told him, it's your big brother. Brendan's in college. This is where he lives. Why don't you say hi to Brendan? John took this all in. Hello, he said, addressing the word to my knees. His voice was soft and mechanical, and the word sounded almost foreign, but still, he fucking said it. Wow, I said. I know. Bethany looked so happy. He's doing great. We finally found the right school. He was pretty good in the car, my dad added. Hardly complained at all. They came in, and I introduced them to Zach, who totally rose to the occasion, making small talk like an Eagle Scout. John was standing in the middle of the room, lost inside his head, while the rest of us chatted about how nice the dorms were compared to the ones my father and Bethany had lived in back in the day. It was the usual story. They got treated like shit, and we got treated like kings. I saw the lounge on the way in, my dad said. That's a big TV. And that communal kitchen, Bethany said. Geez, I wouldn't mind living here for a few months. At some point, John took a couple steps in my direction. I thought he was maybe going to hug me or sit on my lap, but he was just coming to examine the fabric on the couch. The one I was sitting on, which Zach and I had found on the street at the beginning of the semester. It had a weird texture, kind of fuzzy, but also a little slick, almost greasy, and John seemed fascinated by it. He reached out his hand very slowly and started stroking the armrest as if it were a living thing. For a while, the conversation stopped and we all just watched him. I think he likes it here, Bethany told us. Before lunch, we went for a walk. Zach stayed behind, claiming he had work to do. So it was just me, my dad, Bethany, and John. There were lots of official tours available throughout the weekend, but my dad and Bethany didn't think John was ready for something like that. Better to go at our own pace, and not bother anyone else, even if that meant they had to listen to my feeble attempts to impersonate a college student who actually knew what he was talking about. I think that's the science building. Maybe chemistry. I'm not sure. Could be sociology. Yeah, so this is the new gym. It's a lot nicer than the old one. That's what everybody says. I guess the old one smelled really bad. So those are bike racks. Maybe I'll bring a bike next year. Just need to inflate the tires. I'm not sure what that statue is. Some dude from the 1900s. Guess I should read the plaque. I felt like a dumbass blathering on like that, but my dad and Bethany seemed happy enough. Whatever I said, one of them would repeat it to John in simplified language. Look at the bicycles. Look at the statues. That's where people go to exercise. Sometimes John would look where they were pointing, but most of the time he would stare at whatever he felt like staring at. A tree, his own hand, nothing at all. I could see why they were in such a good mood. Given the way things usually went with John, it was a minor miracle to be outside on a beautiful day, walking around a public place like a relatively normal family. I met Bethany's eyes a couple of times, and she gave me this shocked, excited look like, oh my God, can you believe this? I felt pretty good about it myself. It wasn't the fun day that I'd planned. I was still a little pissed about missing the football game, but it was still kind of nice in its own way. We were walking toward the library, Bethany and John trailing behind my dad and me. I was telling him about my econ class, leaving out the part about my D average, when he turned to check on his wife and son. Oh shit, he said. It didn't seem like a big deal at first. John had stopped walking. He was just frozen in place, staring up at the sky. Bethany stood right beside him, looking at my dad with a worried expression. What's wrong? I asked. My dad shook his head and started walking toward John, moving slowly and carefully. He spoke his son's name in a soft voice, but John didn't seem to hear it. His attention was focused on the small plane that was flying overhead at a low altitude, trailing a banner that read, "Welcome, parents." He hates airplanes, Bethany said. It's one of his things. The plane was overhead, buzzing like a giant insect. John let out a yelp, quick and shrill, like someone had jabbed him with a pin. Then he did it again, this time even louder. I could see people turning in our direction, squinting in confusion. John slapped himself in the head. I'm sorry, Bethany told me. He was being so good. It was hard enough to deal with one of John's meltdowns in the house, but it was way worse out in public, with all those strangers around. A gray-haired lady wandered over, asking if the poor thing was okay. Bethany fished a business card from her purse and handed it to the woman. They'd gotten the cards printed up the year before, after an epic tantrum at Target. Please don't be alarmed, it said. Our son Jonathan has been diagnosed with autism and sometimes needs to be physically restrained to avoid injury to himself and others. We love Jonathan very much and only want to keep him safe. Thank you for your understanding. The plane banked away from us, moving toward the football stadium, but I don't think John even noticed. He was rocking from side to side, moaning and clutching his head. And then he punched himself, hard, right above his ear, like it was somebody else's head he was punching, somebody he hated. Please don't do that, Bethany told him. My father sat down on the grass and hugged him from behind, trying to pin his arms, but John fought like crazy to break free, thrashing and screaming. The struggle only lasted a few minutes, but it felt a lot longer. Every time it looked like my dad had John under control, one of his arms would slip free, and he'd start hitting himself again. And then my dad would have to grab that arm without losing control of his other limbs. It almost looked like a game, except that John was drooling, and my father's nose was bleeding from a backwards headbutt. Even so, he just kept speaking quietly the whole time, telling his son that he loved him and that everything would be okay. A pretty good crowd had gathered by then, and Bethany was handing a card to each new arrival, apologizing for the disturbance. "They sound like great parents," Amber said, when I'd finished the story. "Yeah," I said, "they're really patient with him." "What about you?" she asked. "How did you feel while that was happening?" "I just felt sorry for them," I told her. That part was true. I really did feel bad for my dad and Bethany, and even for John, because I knew he couldn't help himself. What I didn't tell her was how sorry I felt for myself and how jealous I was of my little brother, even though that was totally ridiculous. John had a hard life, and I would never want to trade places with him. But that whole time, while he was screaming and thrashing around, I kept thinking how unfair it was that my father loved him so much and held him so tight, way tighter than he'd ever held me, and wouldn't let go no matter what. Thank you. Okay, she in the novel, you notice that this section of Brendan's was narrated in the first person, and everything else in the book is narrated in the third person. Eve's sections from the other minor characters whose stories get told, and the question was why. And this often happens when I write. I didn't have a why. I just started writing Brendan, and it came out in first person, and it felt right, and so I kept doing it that way. But then I would start to do these events and talk about the book, and people would say, "Well, why did you do that?" Because it's an unusual decision. And all I can say is that looking back on it, I think that what it does is it does a couple things. One is that it's a very jarring transition every time you go from a section from Eve's perspective or anyone else's to Brendan's. His voice is just kind of shocks you out of whatever mood you're in reading the book. This is a relatively quiet chapter that I just read from Brendan. Most of the time, he's sort of offensive and awful, and I think it creates a real distance between Eve particularly and Brendan. So the story's about a mother and a son, and the mother is thinking about her son a lot and hoping that he's okay and wanting him to be a good person, and the son is sort of oblivious to that. And I think it sets up this distance between them that's useful for the book. Even in this family, I think they're just living in separate realities, and they're very gendered realities, which is an important part of the book as well. And the other thing is, Brendan is a very limited character. And I think if I were stuck kind of trying to describe the inner workings of his mind, that might be kind of dull. But his voice is sort of interesting, to me anyway. I found him entertaining in his... Eve is a mature adult, and she's often looking at herself and questioning herself and thinking about other people and how they're responding. She's sensitive and thoughtful, and Brendan is always just himself and kind of locked within his own experience of any situation. And I think the first person kind of really emphasizes that aspect of his psychology.
It seemed that you captured John's autistic behaviors very well, and surely as one autistic person would behave. How did you learn about that, and how did you write about that?
That's a number of times when I've done these events, I've spoken to parents who have kids who are on the spectrum, and they're interested to know this as well. I don't have children on the spectrum, but I have friends who do, and in particular, some friends of mine have a very severely nonverbal child, and I remember years ago being at a barbecue and just the child was young and all these kids were running around playing and it was very idyllic and their son just, he couldn't really engage and he found it very disturbing. And I could just see how painful it was for the parents, and it just left this big impression on me. And then when I decided that I was going to write about it, I just did more reading and research. But sometimes as a writer, just you see one thing that makes an impression on you, and I do want to make sure I have the details right. Also, a good friend of mine taught at a school outside of Boston for kids with autism, and he would tell me a lot of stories as well. So I think I've just picked up various stories over the years, but it was the first time I ever wrote about that.
This is about The Leftovers. How did you feel about the series continuing after the book ended, first of all? And second of all, how did you feel about the ending of the series?
Mm-hmm. Well, I knew when I brought the book The Leftovers to HBO that if it became a series that we would move beyond the book at some point. I even thought maybe we would start before the book started, because the book starts, 3 years after the big event. So I kind of knew that we would deal with material that I hadn't dealt with in the book. I was surprised that we got through the book essentially in the first season. And I think, if Damon Lindelof, who is the showrunner and my partner in creating the show, if he were here, he would agree with me if I said that the first year was actually the hardest year, because I think there was a little bit of a struggle between us over kind of ownership of the story in a way, because I was sort of defending the choices I'd made in the book, and he was trying to bring his own sort of storytelling style to the material. And I think if you watch the first season, you can see this show is interesting, but it hasn't quite, at least for the first half of the first season, I think it struggled to find its voice and its tone. And around the middle of the first season, we started to figure that out. And when we found out the show would be renewed and we went back for the second season, it just felt so much more relaxed. Like, okay, we have a chance to extend this story and move in a new direction. And I think you really feel Damon's, he's a very bold storyteller. He's the guy who did Lost. And, the second season begins with a cave woman, 10,000 years ago or whatever that is, and then introduces a whole new family. Our main characters don't even appear till about 50 minutes into the first episode of the second season, and then we've moved everybody to a place in Texas that's become a kind of new holy land. And I just think the show started to become really wild and really something that I had never anticipated. And it was actually a really amazing experience for me to watch the story get transformed and move to new places. And then we did Australia in the final season, as you know. As for the ending, I'm not going to spoil it for anybody, but I really love the ending of the show. To some degree, the show is about belief, and I think we ended up presenting the readers with a story that they have to decide whether they believe. So it poses, in a way, a religious question or a question of faith, which is, here's a story that can provide you with some hope. Do you choose to believe it? To me, that's the essence of the religious question. And we can't know. I mean, the viewer can't know if Nora's telling the truth or not. So you're left with the dilemma of anyone who receives a narrative, a faith-based narrative.
Continuing with The Leftovers, which I have to tell you was, without question, one of the more amazing stories that I've been able to enjoy for a long time. And I would say it's really, for me at least, was very much about loss and about people's response to loss. But I was curious about your reactions about the differences between your novel and the series in terms of the characters. I found a lot of differences between the characters, the way you wrote them in your novel, and the characters in the first season who develop beyond that as well. Not only in the sense of characters like Matt, who's sort of a minor character in the book and becomes a much more major character in the series, but even the nature and depth of the two main characters, which I thought was quite different, or three main characters, I suppose, in the series. Did you have a hand in rewriting it, and how did you feel about the fact that you had a do-over, in a sense?
Yeah, so this is, I think, very closely bound up with what I said before when there was, some tension at the beginning. So just for instance, Kevin Garvey, Justin Theroux's character in the book, is the mayor of the town. And he stands for this principle of, let's get back to normal. Something terrible happened, but let's get our lives back. Let's stop worrying about the past. Let's move into the future. So he's a kind of an optimistic figure in the book. And the change with him, so in the show, he's a cop, and he's a very tormented cop. And that came from HBO, who basically said, your main character is a nice guy, and we don't do shows with nice guys. Their brand was, The Sopranos and, all those sort of cable anti-hero shows. And so that was a note from the network that basically had to do with their brand. But it made sense. It's much more dramatic to have a character be a cop and be, on the ground floor trying to keep order in a place that's falling apart than, a local politician. The real change, I think Laurie is relatively similar to Laurie in the book, except she got a backstory, which instead of being a stay-at-home mom, she's a therapist, which was, again, it was great. It gave us a lot of material, and it became her guiding light for the later season. She becomes Kevin's therapist, in effect, when he thinks he's losing his mind. And Nora also got a job. Nora in the book, because the book is very much about, it's very internal, and it's about how people are managing their grief. And Nora, who's suffered the most, has all these rituals to just get through the day, which include watching SpongeBob and taking notes and going on these long bike rides and trying to challenge herself to go to places where children are because it's so painful for her. But I give Damon a lot of credit for this. He was just sort of saying, it's an obvious thing when you think about a dramatic story. We can't just have Nora sitting at home. Nora's got to be out in the world. And it was just a very bold move to have her be a bureaucrat in charge of, who worked for the Department of the Sudden Departure, who's interviewing people to give them benefits if they've had a loved one who disappeared. And then she becomes this defender of the truth and a kind of a cynic on the show. And so just to give these characters different jobs than what they had in the book turned out to have enormous ramifications in these later seasons. It didn't. I think it's I'll defend the choices I made in the book, but in terms of extending their stories and giving them more of a connection to the world, I think the decisions we made in the do-over really opened things up for us. In the same way that Matt Jameson is essentially who he is in the book, but he becomes Nora's brother. Again, because we wanted to figure out ways to connect these characters and get them naturally together. Because the book, I think, really is about people who are kind of alone in their misery. And the show, we found ways to connect them more. And I think it had really great ramifications for what we did. So I did learn something from that. Though I think my decision to have these people isolated in the book was a principled decision as well, but it's not going to work that well in a dramatic series. So I learned a lot. I had never done long-form TV, and Damon is a master of it. So, we spent about a month before we started writing just, asking questions like, we had pictures of all the characters up there, and we said, like, who is connected to who else, and we'd draw lines, and we'd notice that people like Matt were just kind of out there floating. It's like, we got to bring him into the story. We got to bring him into this web of connected people.
Having had your novels translated into film and TV, what effect has that had on your creativity and writing subsequently? Could you say some more about that, please?
Yeah. So I think the assumption that people often have is that the writing changes and becomes more cinematic, maybe, or that I'm thinking, about an adaptation while I'm writing the fiction. But actually, that doesn't seem to be my experience of it. I recently went back and looked at my book, The Wishbones, which I wrote before I had anything adapted for film, and it looked to me like it was written by the same writer who wrote Mrs. Fletcher, that I hadn't changed enormously over that time. So I think what happened was that my work always felt cinematic on the page, and that was what led it to get adapted so often. But the other thing that happened, because I became a screenwriter and learned that craft, it made me so much more aware of the tools at my disposal as a fiction writer. The ability to go into a character's head, the ability to move in time. So I actually think when I'm a fiction writer now, I'm so aware of all the flexibility I have and the tools at my disposal that I kind of forget my screenwriting self, because screenwriting it's just a very different task, and it's just not as rich. Like writing scripts is great, but the real work is when you get the actors performing it and the directors filming it. The scripts themselves don't ever have the richness, I think, of good fiction. Though the Leftover scripts were pretty amazing. I would love to publish a book that had like 3 or 4 scripts in them, because Damon is the showrunner, and the showrunner does the last pass on them, and so they would come in his voice, and they're very they often address the reader directly, and they have like a lot of comic book punctuation, and they're really remarkable documents. Like a lot of scripts are boring, but the Leftover scripts were never boring.
I have 2 questions. Why did you allow Brendan to fail at college? What was your thinking behind using him as an example of that? And his mother's continuous search for his sexuality and her relationships with television and this woman that she had that got involved with. Can you comment on those 2?
Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but yeah, Brendan struggles in college. To me, it's clear from the minute he leaves home that he's not ready for college, and nothing happens there that changes it. I will say, anecdotally, I know way more guys who have left college before finishing the first year than women. I don't know if that's a statistic borne out by by actual research, but in my life, I've spoken to people I knew growing up, but also sons of people I know now. So I think the book is about Eve's high hopes for Brendan, Eve's sense that college can be this transformational experience, and Brendan resists it. And I think maybe there's some hope at the end that he's ready to try again. But the book is also about Eve coming home as a divorced mom, no longer having to care for her son, and saying, what is my identity now that I'm not a full-time mom? And yeah, she has a professional identity. She runs the local senior center. But she doesn't have the kind of social life that she wants, and she isn't sure. All she knows is that she wants to shake up her life and have new experiences. But she also is looking for love on some level. And the book really is about the way that she shakes up her life and transforms her sense of self during the brief period when her son is away from home. And, that is partly a sexual journey, but I would say it's more a journey of identity. And she finds a new identity in an odd place, which is by becoming obsessed with this amateur porn site that she finds her way to. And it offers her this identity of the MILF. And she tries it on, and when she does, the world looks different. A lot of situations that seemed perfectly innocuous before suddenly have this erotic potential, and she herself suddenly feels empowered to act on it, though she often feels terrible afterwards, because, is this her, or is this some fantasy that she's trying on? But I do think that her story is one of she has the experience that she hopes her son will have, which is that she shakes up her life and finds out some new truths about herself. Making mistakes, but also making friends and having adventures.
Ooh. My question's about endings. I was really impressed with the abstinence teacher and leftovers, the endings. They just were so real to me. So I'm just kind of curious, when you were writing your books, do you know where you're going? Do the endings kind of write themselves? How do you get there?
That's an easy question. I don't know where the stories are going to end. Usually I have a situation when I start, and I don't know my characters yet, and the ending is just so far away. And the other thing is, and I think a lot of writers would agree with me, if you have an ending in mind at the beginning and you actually get there and it's still the ending, you've done something wrong. Because your characters need to grow beyond your original conception of them, and your story needs to take some turns that you didn't anticipate. I think, there is a point, maybe, I remember this with little children especially, where after maybe a year of work, I suddenly see what the question is that the story's trying to answer, and I can see, and I try not to answer it in my head till I get there. And whenever I would push, so in Little Children, the lovers make a plan to run away together. And really the last 100 pages or so are kind of, every beat of the story is pushing you toward they're not going to stay together, or they are going to stay together. And every time I would tell a story, have something move the story in one direction, I would then pull it back in the other direction. So I never knew really until quite late what was going to happen there. And I try to do that. I try to keep myself in suspense for as long as I can. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.